a minute, I didn't know horses had 6 legs. Well, 2 of the horses had 2 slaves walking up behind it. And when they perched them horses, Master got off the horse and he ran toward the house. First thing he said, "Where's that Frederick at? I know he wrote these passes." Well, right away, pass in my pocket went in my mouth. It was delicious with that biscuit. I didn't need butter. I just put it right in my mouth. The other slave, he asked me, "Frederick, what should I do with my pass?" I said, "You want to get a whipping?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, you better eat it." "I can't eat it." "You getting a whipping." He ate that. Next thing you know, we're being dragged to city jail. Now, if you look at my face, and if you look at the smile that I have on my face, I just mentioned they took us to city jail. Who's laughing at city jail, going to city jail? They must be out of their mind laughing to go to jail. Well, the reason we were laughing going to jail because we knew that we was going to get 3 hot meals, we knew that we was going to get a cot, and we knew we could bathe. That's why we were laughing. And I'll have you know, while we were spending our time in that jail, we had those slave owners outside screaming, "We want that Frederick! We want that Frederick! If we get you, Frederick, we're going to skin you alive." They wanted me. Well, ma'am, they couldn't have me because I had a savior. My savior was no other than Master Heward. That's right. Because Master came to me and he said, "Frederick, I have a good mind to send you down to Mississippi." Now, if they would have sent me down to Mississippi, you all would have never heard of Frederick Douglass. Because there's no way I was going to escape from Mississippi. Well, Master took me back to the house. Instead of whipping me, I'll have you know, he taught me a trade. He taught me how to be a ship cocker. That means that how to put cock in the cracks of the wood of the ship. And Master would let me go out and make money. He allowed me, excuse the expression, because I believe we're in 2020, but he allowed me to sell myself. Well, I went out and I got a job. Ladies and gentlemen, I was making $6 a week on that job. I was rich. Yeah, I was rich. Until I got home. And when I got home, I had to give every penny of that $6 to Master Heward. Now, Master Heward started feeling guilty. He felt guilty in such a way that he was stealing my money. He didn't work for it, I did. Well, what Master did, because he was feeling guilty, he turned around and gave me some of that money. A whole big nickel. After a while, I got to my mind, I said, you know, if he's going to continue to take my money, I'm not going to go out there and work. And he said, "Frederick, either you work or I'm going to let you go to Mississippi." So I went out and I worked. But this time, as I got a raise, I went from $6 to $10. Yes, sir. Well, when I would go home with my paycheck, or my money, if you will, I would give Master $6. And I would keep the $4. I had a little hole out in the woods that I would dig every time I got a check, my pay, I put money in that hole. Because I had the mind that September the 3rd, 1838 was going to be my day. Now, I had the great pleasure of meeting a beautiful young lady. I was 19 years old when I met her. Anna Mary. She was a wonderful free slave. And we were courting. Excuse me, do they still court nowadays? Well, we were courting. And all of a sudden, I just happened to mention to Anna that I wanted to run away. That I was tired of being a slave. Well, Anna took it upon herself to begin to start selling some of her merchandise. Anna also knew a gentleman who was in the Navy. Well, with the money that she gained from selling her merchandise and the union of her knowing this gentleman who was in the Navy, she wound up giving me a Navy suit. Red top, white pants, and a little hat to go with it. She also came up with an ID. Yeah, even though the ID didn't look like me. But it had an eagle on And she said, Frederick, this will help you to get to the north. Well, next thing you know, I wound up getting on the train. And when I got on the train, the car that I got on, now please keep in mind, it wasn't like I just walked on like white people did. I snuck on. And when I finally got in my seat by the window, you will know that I was scared. Well, as time went on, and I see the conductor coming, he's like, tickets, ticket, ticket, tickets, tickets. Well, there was a couple of black gentlemen behind me. And what he said to them really got me nervous. He said, you boys got a ticket? You better have a ticket or else I'm turning you in. And he didn't say boys, you know what he said. Well, they had a ticket. And they had their ID passes as well. And then he came to me and he noticed that I had on a military suit. And he said, sir, where are you headed? I said, I'm going back to base, sir. He said, do you have ID? I said, yes, I do, sir. I got my pass. So I go into my pocket and I pull out my pass. Now, I wouldn't let him get it because it had an eagle on it, and if he would have saw the picture, he would have known it wasn't me. So what I did, I flashed it, and then I put it back in. He said, okay, I don't want to hear a sound out of you. I said, sir, you won't hear a peep out of me. I'll be the quietest one on this train. When he walked by me, that's right, I didn't say a word. Sweat coming everywhere. I didn't say a word. We made it up in 24 hours. We made it to New York City. And when I got off that train and I started walking and I saw black men with nice, elegant suits on. I saw black women with nice dresses on with their little pocketbooks hanging. And they were moving so soft and smooth. The gentlemen, as they saw the women come by, I see them taking the hat off to the woman, battle. I was like, wow, these blacks up here are living large. And all of a sudden, as I turned around, I saw the first sign. Warning, runaway slave, $50. Warning, runaway slave, $100. Warning, runaway slave, $200. And that's when I knew I was in danger. Well, again, the saving grace. A gentleman by the name of Mr. Ruffles came up to me. Come to find out, he was a lawyer. Black gentleman, astute gentleman. He says, come go with me. So he takes me to his house. And as he takes me to his house, he allowed me to dress, he allowed me to eat, he allowed me to sleep. And I'll let you know, he knew that about my wife, Anna, well, or I should say my lady friend. The next morning I'll wake up, I come down the stairwell, I'll have you know, sitting in the chair, the sofa, looking so beautiful. It was no other than my Anna. He had sent overnight for my wife. And we married. And then we talked about names. I told you my name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He said, Frederick, you're going to have to change that name. Because if you keep that name, masters will sure enough find you. So we started tossing names up in the air. And he said, I have the perfect name for you. And I said, what is it? He said, Johnson. I said, no, because there's too many Johnsons in the world. I don't need to be another Johnson so master can come get me. Well, we started debating again. And as we debated, he thought about a play he had saw. The name of the play was Lady on a Lake. And he remembered there was a character in the play by the name of Douglas. But this Douglas had one S. I told him I like that name. But I'll take that name, but what I'll do with that name, I'll add another S. So that way, when you pronounce my name, you will pronounce it such as Douglas with the other S. He said, good. So what he did, he put me on the train, me and Anna, and we made our way up to New Bedford, Connecticut. As I got to New Bedford, we got to the New Bedford, Connecticut. We were offered shelter, and I also got a job. Not a job, but to be honest with you, I got 5 jobs. And one day when I was working, a gentleman came up to me and he said, excuse me, sir, have you ever heard of the Liberator? I said, I've heard mention of it. He said, well, here, I got some here. He said, I'll give you one. I said, no, I don't want charity. I'll pay for it. He said, okay. And he said, by the way, what is your name? I said, Frederick Douglass. He said, Frederick Douglass. He said, do you know anything about slavery? He said, it looks like you've been rich all your life. He said, you know anything about slavery? I said, sir, I have slavery all over my back. I graduated from slavery. He said, you was a slave? You don't look like a slave. And next thing you know, he invited me to an anti-slavery meeting. I go to this meeting, and right away, that night, he introduced me to Mr. William Lord Garrison. I took to that white man. I did. And the reason I took to that white man, because I was so amazed that a white man was fighting for black freedom. I was amazed. I loved that man. Well, he had me to get up and speak. I must have been about 23 years old. When I got up to speak, I'll have you know I had the shaky legs, I was nervous, and the whole hall was full of white people. I've never spoke before white people before. I was always told when I get before white people to drop my head and say, yes sir, no ma'am. And when the nervousness left me, I started talking to these white people and telling these white people what was going on down south with the slaves, how they were being tormented, how they were being whipped, and the things that they had to go through. Well, I have you know, when I finished my speech, all those white folks stood up and they gave me a rousing applause. And Mr. Garrison, he came to me and he said, Frederick, you sure you never spoke before? I said, no, sir. You sure you was a slave? I said, yes, sir. I said, I don't have proper education. He says, well, how do you speak so eloquently? How do you use the vocabulary that you use? I said, sir, I stole my education. He said, well, since you stole your education, I would like for you to go on a 6-month tour with us around the United States talking about slavery and the anti-slavery movement. And they were paying me $25 a week. I said, yes. And due to the time, I would love to tell you about some of the adventures that I had on the road. Such as, I'll tell you one if I can, where I was in Buffalo, New York. And I got into a fight. The audience actually came up on stage and started fighting with me. And I said to myself, once I fought with Corvée, I would never bow to anybody else. Well, when I had that fight, I was left for the rest of my life with a break in my left arm, wrist. But it was okay because I wrote with my right. Well, come 1845, I was always told that I needed something to put in the people's hands. 1845, May it was, my first book came out, The Narrative and Life of Frederick Douglass. No one believed that a black man wrote this book. It was always interpreted that a white person wrote it and just put my face on the front. And I had to, in a meeting, I let them know, even William Lord Garrison, who I love so much, I let him know that I was the one who wrote this book. And it was William Lord Garrison who wrote the foreword. But I wrote the book. And ladies and gentlemen, I sold this book for a whopping, per copy, 50 cents. How many copies were sold? 11,000 copies. Well, as I screwed along, there was a gentleman who came in my life by the name of John Brown. Mr. John Brown was another white man that I loved dearly because he fought for black rights and he fought for freedom. Well, Mr. Brown, he stayed in my house for exactly 2 months. I charged Mr. Brown for staying in my house. I charged Mr. Brown a big old $3 a month for staying in my house. And we talked about how we were going to stamp out those slave owners. Well, he talked about, and he was very adamant, about going to Harper's Valley to kill the servicemen and others. And he said, Frederick, you must go with me. And I said, I don't think that's a good idea, John. I really don't think that's a good idea. I fear for you, John. And John and I, we hugged. And when we released each other, he said, whether I live or die. Well, I think it was maybe about 2 weeks later, I heard that he was hanging by the gutties because they killed him in Harper's Valley. And when that happened, I had to escape. I escaped and I went to Canada. I think I was about 27 years old at the time. I stayed in Canada for 2 years. When I came back from Canada, I was 29 years old. Ladies and gentlemen, those Canadians, they sent $750 to Master Hugh Ard. So that meant that when I came back to these American shores, I came back a free man. And even though those Canadians wanted me to stay, I could not help but to think about my wife and my 4 children. I could not help to think about all those other blacks that were in this country that were fighting for freedom and needed someone to fight for them. I took it upon my shoulders to make sure that I was fighting for a good cause. As a matter of fact, moving on, November of 1860, I'll say it again, not Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., not Barack Obama, Frederick Douglass, was the first black man invited into the White House. And when I went into the White House, I had the opportunity to meet President Abraham Lincoln. When I walked into his office and he was sitting behind that long desk, and when he stood up, I never knew the man was so tall, because when he stood up, all I could see was my neck going like this. And he said, "Mr. Douglass, it's an honor to have you in my house." And I said, "Mr. President, thank you for seeing me." And he said, "How can I help you, Mr. Douglass? Have a seat." As I said, "Mr. President, I want to thank you very much for allowing me this visit. Sir, I come to discuss with you the black soldiers having the opportunity to serve in this war. And not only that, I come to discuss with you, sir, not just serving in the war, but I would like the door open so that black soldiers could be treated like men and be paid the same pay that the white soldiers get, and have the opportunity to sleep in the proper shelter such as the white soldiers sleep in. I also come, sir, with another concern, and that concern is the freedom of my people. And lastly, the freedom to be able to vote." Ladies and gentlemen, that was the beginning of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Well, as I took a pause, Mr. Lincoln got up and he went to the window and he looked out the window and he says, "Mr. Douglass, I'll have you know that if we allow blacks to be free, we will run into all kind of trouble that we're not ready to run into." Well, I'll have you know, ladies and gentlemen, as I take a pause, as he was looking out the window, it was 1860. What he saw was 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. speaking in Washington, D.C. Now just imagine, if it wasn't until 1963 when blacks would be liberated, just imagine where you would be at as you sit here right now, going back. He turned back around and he said, "Well, Mr. Douglass, we'll work on it." And before you know it, in 1863, January 1, I was in Rochester, New York, where my family and I had moved. And this is prior to the KKK bombing my house on 1st Street in Rochester, New York. We were all gathered on the night of December the 31st, 1862. And before we know it, a gentleman rode up on a horse, and he had a document, and he unrolled it, and he said, "Let it be known that on this day of our Lord, January the 1st, 1863, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, has declared that all blacks in this country is free from this day forth." And that was the emancipation President Abraham Lincoln signed courtesy of Frederick Douglass. Well, we were jolly that night, and I'll have you know, from 3 days straight, we filled up the churches. And we prayed, and we prayed, and we prayed. Well, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln called for me again in January. He paid my way this time, sir. And I met with him, and he said, Mr. Douglas, the reason I call you is because I understand there are blacks who do not know, as of yet, that they are free. I would like for you to round up some soldiers and go out west and alert the blacks that they are free out there as well. Juneteenth. I don't know if that rings a bell.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, not long after, at the Ford Theater, President Abraham Lincoln and Miss Mary Lincoln were enjoying the theater. A crazed gentleman by the name of John Wilkes Booth snuck into the privacy of President Abraham Lincoln and assassinated him. Well, upon having a memorial for Mr. Lincoln at Lincoln Memorial Park in Washington, D.C., I just happened to be there because I respected. Now, I'll let you know that I did not like, but I respected Mr. Abraham Lincoln. And they had a lawyer that spoke. Everybody booed him, and they noticed I was in the audience, and they said, Frederick, we want you to come to speak. And I got up and I spoke. And I was not ashamed to tell that audience that Mr. Abraham Lincoln, though he freed us, we were not his children. We were treated as stepchildren. I have great respect for him in all. Well, once I finished and I walked off the stage, his wife was standing right there, Miss Mary Lincoln. Miss Mary Lincoln, as I got to the last step, she said, Mr. Douglas, thank you for that wonderful speech in honor of my husband. And here, please, take this cane. It is yours. It's my husband's walking stick. That walking stick is still in my home in Anacostia on Cedar Hill. As time goes on, as I began to come down, I became the first black to be a president of a national bank, Freeman National Bank. Not only that, in 1857, unbeknownst to me, I was nominated as vice president. I got one vote as vice president of these United States. In 1888, at the Republican National Convention, I was nominated once more for president of these United States. I got one vote. And as I get ready to bring it in, February 20th, 1895, I went out to speak for women's suffrage. As a matter of fact, the carriage outside, when I walked into the carriage, there was a young lady sitting in there. That young lady just happened to be Susan B. Anthony. I don't know if that name rings a bell. We rode off to the Washington Convention Center, and I spoke. And after I spoke, she helped me back to the carriage. And by this time, because I moved so fast, just to go back, my wife Anna had passed away in 1884 after 40 years of marriage. So 22 years later, I must admit, I remarried. I remarried to a young lady by the name of Helen Pitts. She was white. My daughter Rosetta resented it very much. However, on this day, when I returned from the speaking engagement, I made it up to the house. Helen was in the kitchen, entertaining guests and drinking tea. When I came in, I said, Helen, I'm home. She says, okay, are you hungry? I said, no, I'm just going to go up and rest until my next meeting. Well, as I began to go up that step, I fell, I jerked. And she could hear the step, and she said, Frederick, stop playing. Well, that's where I had my major heart attack. And I passed away on February the 20th, 1895, at the age of 77. Ladies and gentlemen, I went from being born on February the 14th, 1818 as a slave, and I died as a statesman on February the 20th, 1895 at the age of 77. I became the first black man to lay in state in the Washington, D.C. Capitol, meaning that I had kings and queens that came up from abroad to say goodbye to this slave. I am currently buried in Rochester, New York. So if you ever get a chance, come visit me. I'll be glad to see you. And with that,